Welcome to Career Practitioner Conversations. This podcast is presented by the National Career Development Association. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA's Director of Professional Development, and this episode features a conversation about building a neurodiverse-affirming practice. With me today are Janine Rowe and Elle O'Flaherty. Janine is a licensed mental health counselor in private practice and a CCC credential holder with NCDA. And Elle is the principal of Interlace Solutions and a current co-chair of NCDA's Government Relations Committee. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Really excited to be here, having this conversation and building collaborative relationships with neurodiverse students and neurodiverse clients is something that I'm really passionate about. I really enjoy it and have found it a career sustaining factor in work targeting this group of job seekers. Maybe we should really fully define neurodiversity first so we know who's our population and who we're referring to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So neurodiversity is a strengths-based approach for brain-based conditions associated with autism spectrum, ADHD, and different ways of thinking. And so this really moves our field from a deficit model, from understanding things like autism spectrum disorder and ADHD as a list of deficiencies or things that somebody's challenged with, to a more holistic understanding that really these are associated with really positive traits. Of course, there are some challenges that can come along with that as well. So just want to frame our thinking around that way. Elle, is there anything that you would add in how you understand neurodiversity?
No, I'm glad that you said that. Absolutely. I liken it to I'm left-handed, so this analogy makes sense for me, but I think of it as being left-handed. It's not a good or a bad thing. It just is. However, not that many of us are left-handed in society. And so it was built for right-handed people. And so naturally we run into things that are more challenging for us. And we just need the right tools to be able to do it in the way that works for us. And I think of that very similarly with folks like me. I'm ADHD, who are part of the neurodivergent community, that it's not a good or a bad thing. It's not an affliction, in my opinion. And this is where I do have some beef with the DSM-5 because I don't love how ADHD and ASD are described, but I just think of it as a different kind of brain.
Yeah, exactly. I found, part of how I think about building a collaborative relationship takes me back to how I got started in this work, which might be interesting to share. I got started doing this work and working with this population really based out of a need that I was observing working with college students, that there were a lot of students who were identifying as being on the autism spectrum, who are identifying as having ADHD. I was also noticing a lot of clients that had maybe characteristics that would overlap with the neurodiverse community, but maybe didn't identify with being a part of the neurodiverse community. And I was finding they're really experiencing career development and a job search process quite differently than their neurotypical peers. Then there were some potholes for them that really influenced the way that I was doing my work. And so I was interested in what can I do differently as a career counselor? And also recognizing that a lot of neurodiverse students have had quite negative experiences with seeking help in the past from their teachers or previous counselors, even parents, that maybe they've received a lot of negative feedback. And so they may be arriving to my office feeling negatively about themselves or feeling like they have negative outcome expectations about how this process is going to go. Or they were referred to me because a parent or a teacher or somebody in their life said, I want you to do this, go to career counseling and figure out how to get a job. And they may not have had as much buy-in to that process or be aware of what the goals of career counseling were. So those are some of the initial things that I noticed in just how people are approaching even the first appointment. Ella, is that consistent with your experience?
Definitely. And I think one of the challenges is that people are not as well informed about neurodiversity writ large. I speak before a lot of conferences for doctors and counselors and folks. And after doing that for a while, I came to realize that for most doctors and therapists, their entire training on ADHD was about 15 to 20 minutes in school. And I think most people don't have the right foundational knowledge to be able to work with our community. And so I think one of the first things is to be interested. And anyone who's listening to this podcast, I want to thank them, because just being interested and wanting to be an ally, and then taking the next step to inform yourself and make sure that you have the right knowledge of ADHD, autism spectrum, dyslexia, dyscalculia, whatever it might be in the neurodiverse umbrella. And if you happen to be a career development professional, understanding how that impacts what careers are good for us. And so I find a lot of times that there's a lack of understanding, and that's why people have these sort of negative interactions. I also think that I'll be honest, most of the training that I've seen out there about neurodiversity often focuses solely or most extensively on the challenges. And so when you're talking about having a strengths-based approach and talking, I always like with clients to talk first about their strengths and the gifts that come with neurodiversity. I think that is such a validating and healing place to start from. And when we're talking about building a collaborative relationship, it instantly helps to start building that trust and that understanding that the person you're talking to gets you and values you, instead of thinking that you're a problem to solve. But I see you nodding your head. What do you think?
I love what you say. I also find myself with my colleagues gently challenging some assumptions and even some of the language that comes along with working with a neurodiverse client. Even words like, this is a complex person, or difficult, or maybe holding assumptions about the types of careers that would be a good fit for a neurodiverse person. I would like to gently push back on those because of trying to use a strengths-based perspective, but because these assumptions are, usually not accurate and usually contributing to a stigmatized way of working with the client.
Thank you so much for doing that, by the way. And I love that you do it gently. I do it loudly, usually, in my talks. It's so important. ADHD, for instance, and definitely autism spectrum as well, is one of the most stigmatized groups out there. And there's a study I saw that shows that more than 90% of neurotypical folks see ADHD as a very negative thing, which has so many downstream effects, so many awful things. And you, just by pushing back and making sure that people aren't promoting that and underscoring it, is so helpful. And also, I work with professionals. I only work with adults. And so by the time they get to me, usually I'm the first person ever to tell them what's normal for people in our community, and also that there is nothing wrong with them. And I find that they're carrying so much shame and guilt that the fact that you are starting that work when kids are in college, when people are younger, that has to make a world of difference, just on their mental health impacts alone.
I hope so. Thank you.
Very cool. I have a question for you. As a counselor, one of the big things that I've been looking at is integrating. So I'm a trained ADHD coach, and as well as career coach and all those good things. I've been looking at how we can better integrate some of these service providers and the support network around neurodiverse folks. And so I think it's been really interesting as a coach, talking to counselors and trying to educate them on what we do and the difference in our lanes and how we can collaborate, not just with our client, but also as the care team around them. Do you have any experience with that or anything you'd like to share?
I think that's so critically important. A lot of the clients I would work with have a significant care team, and that usually can involve a parent or two, family members, different therapists and coaches that they may be working with. And I have found sometimes career development practitioners are reluctant to engage the team, or maybe have a view that, hey, well, this is a young adult, they ought to be operating autonomously and independently without these supports. So I find it often I'm the one initiating that collaboration and really working on defining my roles and helping to define the goals, how I see my work. And I have found that nobody has ever turned me down to say, I don't want to collaborate with you, or I don't value what you're doing. People value career development work so much. They're so happy that we're at the table. So broaching that is a great first step. I want to add to, you're talking about the field of coaching and counseling and career counseling in general. And a lot of us are neurotypical. And I was reading a study recently, I can link it in the show notes, that demonstrated the communication between neurotypical and a neurodiverse conversational partners was the most strained for both members of the conversation. Conversations
I can
between,
absolutely attest to that.
yeah, neurotypical were satisfied with their conversation, and so were neurodiverse and neurodiverse conversational partners. So it's people like me who are neurotypical working with neurodiverse clients that both may find it difficult, unpleasant, feeling like, I don't know if I got my point across. And so I just feel like naming that for those who are listening who may be also neurotypical, if you're feeling like, geez, I don't know if my sessions are effective. I don't know if my counseling style is effective. There's some research that says it can be challenging. What's your experience with that?
So this is my favorite part of a lot of my talks that I give, talking about communication, because I love to start out my talks talking about how we as neurodiverse people are providing reasonable accommodations to neurotypical people. And so, for instance, when we're communicating, ADHD people, our brains filter out less information. So we see more and we're able to make more connections, and our brains are really fast, usually faster than neurotypical people. And so when we're talking to each other and we're talking about a new idea, for instance, we'll say A plus B so F. And we'll be like, yeah, A plus B so F. Yep. But when we're talking to neurotypical people, we have to say A plus B and all the steps in between to get to F. And when we're in meetings, like if there's a problem that needs to be solved, for most of us, we'll sit there in the first 5 minutes and say, okay, this is what we need to do. Let's do it. But then we have to sit through another hour or week or year of meetings while neurotypical people socialize themselves and get used to and think about taking action. And so I love talking about this in a way that this is one of our superpowers. We quickly see ideas and solutions, but it can be challenging for our neurotypical friends because they just need more time to catch up to us. And I love framing it that way because typically we think of how neurotypical people are having to put up with fill in the blank, whatever it is. And so it's going in both directions. And I think that that's really critical to understand. Many of us often also speak super quickly, as you may have noticed I do. And so when we're talking, like right now, I am seriously slowing down my speech because I know I'm talking to neurotypical people. It sounds absolutely insane in my head, but it's another accommodation that I do because neurotypical people typically can't keep up with my speech pattern, whereas ADHD people often can. And so I like framing it that way. So we aren't just thinking of it as a one-sided thing, but rather as you as the career development professional are thinking about how you can be better at communicating and more open to people who have neurodiversity. Just remember that it's happening in the opposite too, that people are accommodating you, even though you probably have no idea and haven't really ever thought about it.
I haven't heard that framing before. That neurodiverse person making reasonable accommodation for their neurotypical conversational partner or team member. Is that similar to masking?
So it's the opposite of masking. And I have to say that I am the only person that I know of who speaks of it in reasonable accommodations from our end, but it makes me very joyful. So I continue to say it. Masking is where we are trying to, whether we're doing it consciously or not, trying to fit in to neurotypical society by covering up some of our normal neurodiverse traits. Whereas when I think of reasonable accommodations, it's more like we have to dull down a little bit of one of our natural gifts because it's too much for most neurotypical people. They can't keep up with us. And so it's not that we are masking to appear neurotypical. It's more we're turning down our shine and our gifts a little bit so that other people can keep up with us. And also, I think that's a really cool way to think of it too, because you never hear people talk about that in the neurodiverse community or about the neurodiverse community.
Yeah. I hear a lot about and talk a lot about the cost or the emotional resources and mental resources that are spent down with masking or trying to appear neurotypical. And I imagine even you describing, I'm really consciously changing my rate of speech for you. Mm-hmm. It just makes me think about how much effort is involved in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it is effortful, definitely, but hopefully that helps to make it a two-way street, to understand that I am also doing things to make it easier for you. And so when we have people who are providing services or working with neurodiverse folks, that it doesn't feel as cumbersome because we understand that it's happening in both directions. Does that make sense?
It definitely does. Yeah.
So I have a question. You're neurotypical. What got you interested in our community?
It's a great question. As I mentioned before, my interest came from the need that I was seeing on the college campus I was working at, and that students did not seem to be moving through the career development process. Our neurodiverse students didn't seem to be progressing at the same rate as their peers, and were having less success in their career development office. And I really didn't like that. But I also found a lot of the joy in the one-on-one work that I was doing. I found it interesting, engaging. I liked talking about different interests that people had. And I also, using my background in licensed mental health counseling, I think I was leveraging a lot of those skills as well. So from there, I just started doing more and more. And that grew into doing a lot of collaboration with potential employer partners to do some education for them and help them look at their recruitment, interviewing, onboarding, and retention processes to help make them more neurodiverse affirming. And that is when I found, the appetite for that. I couldn't have imagined how many people are connected to this community, either because they themselves are part of the community, they have a family member, or they are aware that the neurodiverse community has some really unique traits that they need as part of their operations.
So now that you've worked with our population and educated yourself and you're educating others, what one or two things would you say are like the top tips you would give to another career development professional?
I love that question. So much I can say.
It's hard to narrow it down.
I know it's hard to narrow it down. I don't know if it's a top tip, but something that I think is most important is recognizing that it is. So I work primarily with students on the autism spectrum and young adults on the autism spectrum is my area. And reinforcing it is a spectrum. So no two people on the spectrum are the same, and you worked with one, that's wonderful. The next student that you work with may have identify similarly, and they are going to experience different areas of challenge potentially and strengths. Even as something as simple as, and there's things like using person first language versus identity first language has been a big shift for a lot of us in the mental health counseling field and in the career development world, because a lot of us were trained that we should use person first language. So person with autism, person with dyslexia. And now the students, our clients, are giving us feedback. Hey, this is my identity. I'm an autistic adult. It's not a bad thing. And it's not a negative thing. It's just a part of who I am, just like I'm right or left-handed or other important identity factors. So I think a lot of what I do, it's really ironic because a lot of career counselors will tell me that they struggle with some rigidity and inflexibility in their autistic and neurodiverse clients. I want them to think more openly. But I also want my peers to think more flexibly and openly about their clients and know that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
I love that. And we're such a good pair because you specialize mostly in ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and I'm mostly working with ADHD folks. And so I will give the companion piece for ADHD. Here's the secret. This is the secret sauce to working with ADHD, and it's very important. The number one difference between us and neurotypical people is that we have interest-based brains. ADHD is probably the dumbest name ever for how our brains actually work because we don't lack attention. Instead, we have situationally variable attention. But the cool thing as a career development professional is when we are interested in something, when it uses our strengths and skills and we're really into it, we go into hyper focus, which neurotypical people talk about a flow state, but I'm talking about 12 hours without realizing you haven't gotten up from the desk. Like we love what we love. And so as a career development professional, it's cool because it's a waving green flag about what we're into and what we're good at. And whereas with neurotypical clients, you might need to say, what are your strengths and skills and all that good stuff? Ask your client, tell me when you get into hyperfocus, tell me about what you're doing and then tease it apart. So was it this particular part that you loved? Was it this? And looking at through lines and seeing what gets us into hyperfocus is the most powerful way to find a career that is highly satisfying for us because we have interest-based brains. If we aren't interested in our work, and I say this as someone who was an attorney for almost 20 years, it's a little painful. We have to white knuckle our way through it. And so following the interest and helping your client to see and value where their interests lie is so powerful. And I know that's true of everyone, but it's just cool that we have this shortcut of hyperfocus.
I so appreciate you naming that because, of course, neurodiverse and neurotypical clients, we all want to do something that we're interested in. And yes, of course. And you are really pointing out how this is experienced in the ADHD mind. Can you talk a little bit about how you help shape the interest area into the career path or into the skills around the interest that are needed to be successful in a certain area? Because this is something that I do a lot with my clients. I'd be really curious what you do.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, in order to identify them, I have two exercises that I recommend. One is asking your client to keep a list on their phone or whatever's easy of things that get them into hyperfocus between sessions so that you can have real life examples and tease those apart together. The second thing I highly recommend is and this part is not great, but if you ask an ADHD person what their strengths are, many of my clients will say, I don't have any, or I don't know what my strengths are, because they've had such negative messaging about themselves that it's really hard for us to internalize and notice our strengths. So instead, I ask questions like, what do you learn very quickly? Or what do other people come to you for advice on? some of these other questions that aren't directly asking it, because that can be really overwhelming for a lot of ADHD people. And then once you have those, I like to tease them apart. And so sometimes superficially, what someone's interested in. I have a client who I was just talking to who was interested in a video about Star Wars. And at first you would think they're interested in Star Wars, right? But then I asked a bunch of questions and I said, it's interesting the way you're describing that. It sounds like they're pulling the story apart and looking at the pieces. And so is it that you enjoy understanding like how things work beneath the surface and kind of putting those puzzle pieces together? And they were like, yeah, that's actually what I really enjoy. So talking it through, asking a lot of questions, and then taking those and interpreting them as skills. So this person has really good skills when it comes to problem solving, when it comes to pattern recognition, which a lot of ADHD people do, and other things that you can tease out from that, which then can correlate into occupations. Most ADHD people, when you say, okay, these 10 occupations might align with those, will have strong feelings about the position. And when they do, I say, believe them. Because if it's something that they have an ick to, then just get it off the list. But the other side of that rainbow, and this is where it gets challenging, I have many people who like the idea of a job or they enjoy studying about that in school, but the reality of what it's like day to day is not great. For instance, on paper, I was an international trade lawyer. And it was very interesting, right? I would go talk, I represented the US before the United Nations and different places, but most days I was sitting alone at a desk reading dense text, which is not my jam. So helping to encourage them to look into what the actual work looks like, what the surroundings look like, who are the other people, is also really important. And I know for everyone, but especially for ADHD people or neurodiverse people, because we have some additional needs often. I put together a mnemonic and I'm happy to share my slide on it. I use Slip Move, and it talks about the kinds of things that are really important to us in a career. And it's things like the M is for movement. Many of us need movement throughout the day. And if we have to sit in meetings or sit still all day, it's not going to be great. We also like variable tasks. We like constant learning, things like that. So understanding what many of us, although we're not monolithic, but what many of us need to have a career that we really love, I think that's super important. That was an extremely long answer to your question, but
I'm right there with you. And I think that is so critically important of working from the interest, helping the client to recognize the skills that are connected with that, and then helping connect that to the world of work and what are the sort of ancillary skills, the work environment, everything that goes along with that. I have a very similar practice. Many neurodiverse clients also arrive to my office and they're may have a high interest area or what's called in the diagnostic criteria is a restrictive interest, but really that just means something that is captured their attention for many hours, for many years, and they can, often it's associated with a lot of skills, like you said. So a lot of times clients will come and say, I'm really interested in video games. My career is video game designer, and that's my goal. And I have found alongside them, sometimes the reality of that position is not what they hoped it would be and not what their expectations are. And so my goal is to help that interest area is a starting point, not an end point. So I'll give you an example. Worked with a client recently that studied video game design and development and had a few different internships in that field and is really struggling to find a permanent full-time position in that field. what he's really good at is color continuity because of his attention to detail, the way that he experiences the games. And color continuity is very much in demand in all kinds of fields, from entertainment, web, human-computer interaction. So we are branching into, this is what you're really good at and what's captivating you. And let's see if we can't branch into this area. So it is a starting point, not an ending point.
That is such an interesting point. You're making a light bulb just went off, because for ADHD clients, usually I'm trying to help branch them out. And it sounds, or I'm sorry, we're usually trying to bring them into what it is they want to do. And it sounds like for folks on the autism spectrum, that it's helping to branch them out and think of where one thing can lead to.
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
That's really interesting.
Also, what is the deal with video game developers? Everyone I talk to in academia tells me that like all of their clients want to make video games. Isn't it an epidemic?
Maybe, but also I can see why. Like we were talking about before, people want to do something they're interested in, and video games have been a part of our clients' lives for as soon as they could hold a controller. But there are not enough jobs for as many people that want to work in that field. And that's why this branching process and using it as a starting point is really important.
You know what I love about your answer, about how you described that client interaction? You weren't at all dismissive. You weren't saying, like, oh, you want to design video games. That's not going to happen. So let's figure something else out. But you were really supportive. Just the way you talked about it, you were like, yes, that's a cool idea. Like, how could we take this and run? And I love that, because oftentimes people who are neurodiverse, we can excel in non-traditional workplaces and occupations. And sometimes people try to force us into, no, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse, whatever, instead of really listening to what we're saying and letting us riff on it. So I love how you handled that. Is that ever a challenge for you when people come in with off the wall ideas?
If it becomes a problem for me, then I would probably be in a state of significant burnout. This is the most fun thing you can do, is riff on what somebody's interested in. Like, it is so fun.
I totally agree.
So it can be a little, I don't know, if it's an unfamiliar field, then it may be more difficult to guide that conversation, but that's an opportunity for us to learn. Mm-hmm. Even if it does sound like, one that I'm getting a lot right now is people want to be involved in being a YouTube, making money on streaming YouTube and doing voice acting. And so that's been one where I'm learning a lot more about entrepreneurship to be able to help clients branch from there. Yeah,
I love that. That is really cool. Because sometimes people aren't as supportive, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I think is really important for people in our occupation to know is that neurodiversity is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so if we disclose in our university or in our workplace, then we do have certain legal protections. I would say a lot of people don't know that. And unfortunately, many people in HR and other parts of companies, at least my clients, have experienced that they don't know that. As far as disclosing goes, though, that is an important and strategic choice. I can only speak for ADHD, but for us, about 68% of us never disclose in the workplace. And of those who do, about half will not receive the accommodation they've asked for, will be passed over for promotions, or will be fired. And so before your student or client discloses, it's really important to talk through the strategy of when they do and don't want to do that. And unfortunately, at least for ADHD, I usually recommend, unless people are facing firing or another serious situation, that they do not disclose, because it's too stigmatized, and that's just true. Which is another reason why I'm out and proud, because I'm very unlikely to fire myself, although you never know. So how else do you last question here. I just want to know, how else do you make sure that your practice is neurodiverse affirming and welcoming?
Yeah, great. I love that you bring up the question about disclosure. I think it's a something that sometimes career development practitioners maybe assume that everybody should disclose because more information is better. You're giving self-awareness. That's a good thing in interviews and things, and we ought to be out and open. And most of my clients believe that they should not disclose ever. So a real disconnect there in the perception of what's the right thing to do. So it is a highly individualized decision, everything from what to say, who, when, what to ask for. I usually advise my clients that to help them time the process and the decision is if and when they are requesting a reasonable accommodation, to help that guide the conversation rather than it can add a lot of stress to the interview if my client has to think about, okay, I got to answer all the questions and I got to somehow tell them I'm on the autism spectrum. I'd like to try and separate those things. Yeah.
At least for us, if you tell your interviewer that you're ADHD, unfortunately, people often interpret our traits as laziness or irresponsibility. So it can very significantly impact the likelihood that you'll get the job. And one of the ways that I get around that is I counsel people to reframe the accommodation as a strength. So for instance, we tend to have challenges with our short-term memories. So instead of saying, I need a note taker because of my ADHD, I'll say, I find that I best contribute to conversations when I'm able to just really be in the moment and really taking in what everyone's saying and immediately bouncing off that. So would you mind if I used this AI note taker because it'll help me take notes without me actually having to take myself out of the conversation? And so by reframing it as a strength, you both don't have to disclose. And also it comes across as a positive to your supervisor. Do you ever recommend things like that?
Absolutely. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from employer partners that say it improves the workflows for everybody on the team.
Of course.
So now we have a written manual of our workflows. We didn't have that before, but an autistic employee asked for it. Now everybody uses it. So you're absolutely right.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I have to know though, how do you make your practice neurodiverse, inclusive, and welcoming?
That's great. So many ways, from having online scheduling available, because sometimes picking up the phone is difficult for neurotypical and neurodiverse people. I have really changed the way that I make small talk because that can be off-putting or uncomfortable or not seem important. I have done a lot to structure my sessions. Usually I offer an agenda for what we're going to try to accomplish. I may do briefer sessions more frequently that are working sessions where I'm working alongside my client or working collaboratively in a Google Doc. I think are all ways that I can reduce but hopefully reduce some anxiety and maybe stress just about even making it to the appointment.
I love that so much. You reminded me that I'll often switch up my words from what do you feel about that to what do you think about that? Yeah. I find for many of us in the neurodiverse community, it's hard to talk about our feelings, but thinking is much easier for us to connect with. Sort of similar.
Exactly. Or even using less open questions, which, as a counselor, how I'm going to use less open questions. That's my training day one. But how did the interview go? I don't know what to say. But if I say, what came easily to you in the interview? What was the hardest part? I'm going to get a lot more information with those closed questions.
Absolutely. Those can be so overwhelming. I remember a therapist asking me questions like that and me thinking in my head quickly, what do I say? What do I do? So I love that you do that.
Yeah. I really feel like I could talk to you all day.
I feel the same way about you. This has been such a pleasure. And Melissa, thank you for letting us chat.
Elle O'Flaherty and Janine Rowe, thank you so much for bringing this topic to the podcast, sharing your experiences and expertise. I think our listeners are going to enjoy the conversation and have a lot of takeaways. So if you're listening, be sure you check the show notes for links and more resources. And again, Janine and Elle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.